terms of this presentation today, I'd like to walk you through project data analytics and its influence on project delivery. So in terms of journey so far, I've got a background in engineering and major project delivery, so I've been working in project program and portfolio management. And from that, in about 2015, I started to do quite a lot of work on lessons learned, and I found that it's problematic. I've been around various government departments and I've been mining public source data and open source data, and I've put in quite a lot of freedom of information requests. So I think there's some challenges in terms of that lessons learned, and I'll touch on that in a bit. I've moved on now, and I don't really think it's about the pure lessons learned, it's about the contextualized application of those lessons learned, and that's through this thing which I believe is leveraging experience as opposed to learning lessons, and I'll explain why. So in terms of leveraging experience, this is a build slide which starts to walk you through various challenges which I've picked up from various articles across the world. So you'll see from it the list of projects is large and varied. So it's not a one-off situation that these projects are failing. They keep on failing, and these are the big ones which have failed, and there's loads of projects which are moving out as well and not performing to expectation. I'd start to question our profession. Are things actually getting better? In terms of all of this impact as well, it's not just about the cost of the project, it's the cost to society as well. It's the on-cost of failure, the loss of service, and the impact of others. And I'll give you an example. With NHS 24, for instance, it resulted in a capability being taken away, and that was because of some safety critical concerns. On top of that, there was a 73% increase in project spend, and that amounted to a £55 million overspend on something which is basically a call centre. Edinburgh Tram had an original budget of around 375 million, and there's some variance in terms of documentation on that, up to 498 million. The final cost of that is going to turn out at about £1 billion, so it's gone way over budget, and that's for a shorter track than was originally sanctioned as well in the first place. There's an investigation which is being conducted on this at the moment, it's a public inquiry, and so far that lessons learned process has cost at least £7 million just for those investigations. I'd be interested in looking forward 2 years and saying, have we really learned some lessons from that? So I think we've got a lot to do, and in terms of those projects that I've just flagged up there, that amounts to about £20 billion, and that's just the tip of a very large iceberg. So in terms of the productivity gap, there's a lot of this has been published in the media as well about the productivity gap. There's some documents being published by government, and there's a chart from the Office for National Statistics as well. And it shows you there in terms of construction projects that productivity has largely flatlined, yet in manufacturing there's been a major step forward. So what's the reason for that? And in terms of your projects, they're probably somewhere between those two, I'd imagine. So what's keeping this productivity back? On top of that, if we look at the PMI's data on the pulse of the profession, there's some charts there in terms of project failures all the way through to the project successes which met the original goals and the business intent. Now, I've just drawn some trend lines on this. You can argue about where those trend lines are drawn, but you'll see that there's not a large incline on those trend lines. They're either flat or just slightly moving. So I think that in 6 years or 7 years of taking this data, that's quite a disappointing picture really. As a profession, I think we should be doing a lot better than this. And it's not just the trend lines either. So if you look at those trend lines, which is for completed original budget and completed on time, you'll see that that is approximately less than 55%. So that's, for me, is a situation which is not acceptable really. It's something which we should be trying to drive forward and improve. And as a profession, it's not really improving at the rate that it should be. In terms of this leveraging experience, I thought, where do we start to find this experience? So I looked at the government major projects portfolio, and I looked at the RAG reports on various projects in 2016, and this is all published data. So you'll see from this chart is that there's one project on there that is red and 3 projects which are green, and this is just one subset. There's a lot more projects. There's about 143 projects in the latest portfolio. So you'd think if there's only 3 projects which are going to plan, that there'll be plenty of opportunity to leverage experience. So what I then did is I drilled down a little further into the detail as well. And when I was working this slide up a couple of months ago, I'd put in some freedom of information requests to get access to some data. And basically the day after writing this slide, I received something on the Future IT sourcing program. And in terms of that program, it was listed as amber red on that slide. And you'll see in 2012, it's a forecast end date of 2014, with some whole life costs of 138 million. The following year, it's moved out by 2 years and it's gone up $1 billion. Now, even if that's a typo in the data, which it shouldn't be because it's published data, but I give them the benefit of the doubt, it's moved out by 2 years and it's only an amber project. You'll notice as well that the overall cost is now 2.8 billion, and that's probably still climbing. And if that's the case, these projects appears to be underscored in terms of the RAG rating, and there's some massive lessons to be learned in there because of the overall cost escalation and the schedule variance. So I then got something back from the project team in terms of the lessons learned. I'd like to share that with you now. So that was the lessons learned that they shared with me. Now it's a freedom of information request. It's supposed to be full disclosure, and that is the disclosure which I was given. So the cost has increased by £2.6 billion, and the lessons learned on that report amounts to a page of A4, and even that is fairly anodyne. So for me, there's something that we need to do in this area. This is a recent example from the government major projects portfolio. It's a different project, and I got this through a couple of weeks ago. And I'd just like your view in terms of Mentimeter, what you think about that lesson learned as an observation. In terms of those lessons learned, what we'd like to find out is what's been done about them across government. In terms of lessons learned, it's not just a government problem, but there's lots of data in the public domain as opposed to the private sector domain, which we can then start to bridge. I've been told by various people that the National Audit Office will sort this problem out. It's their job to look into these lessons learned and publish documentation on it. So what they do is they go into an organisation, they do a bit of a project audit, and they publish a report on it. So I spoke to Sandy Gordon about this, and he gave me an hour of his time, and is excellent in terms of his insights, and he's published a blog on it, and I'd commend that to you as well. I think it's a really good blog. And then he's published a statement as well following that blog, is that we are struggling to leverage these past failures and really make sure that that experience is pulled into future project delivery. So when I talked it through with Sandy, the NAO remit stops in terms of it's an audit organisation. It's not there necessarily to change all government departments because they're responsible for their own processes and project delivery. So therefore, it's not about the NAO delivering this. It's the role of departments. It's to leverage that experience, not the NAO. It's their job to flag it up, but it's not their job to influence that change. So I think I'd just like to challenge people out there who are thinking that it's the National Audit Office job to solve this problem. It isn't. It's the individual departments. And in terms of the private sector as well, I'd say in terms of those organisations, where does the responsibility reside for leveraging this experience inside of your organisation, and that correlation between your organisation and your near neighbours in terms of what other experiences have been learned? Where does that responsibility reside? I think that's the challenge. So in terms of these lessons learned, we've now collated, it's getting close to 20,000 lessons learned now across 50 organisations, about 1,000 projects in climbing, estimated portfolio of about $30 billion. It's taken 2 years to pull it in. It's a massive data set, and it's covering 3 continents as well. So it extends into the US, across Europe, and into Australia and New Zealand as well. There's a lot of variance in that data set, from benefits clearer all the way through to some fairly detailed insights, and some of those insights can be quite forensic, and I tend to find that those with a very mature P3M level, sort of 3 or 4, start to be a lot more insightful, and it's those people I think who can really start to extract some insights from this information, but I still don't think that's good enough. When I worked up that data set, I thought, right, what do we do with this data set next? Do we start to pull out some themes and look at those themes and work out what we can do with them? So I reached into some information from the New Zealand government, and that's the chart on the left-hand side. And you'll see from there, every 50 assurance reports, they publish an update to their report. And you can go to that link and you can get some insights into that documentation set. So all it's doing is saying if the report talks about a theme, it's flagged up in this chart. You'll see that this has been going on for nearly 4 years now, and there's no overall trend in some of that data. Some of it's going up, some of it's going down, but it's not demonstrating a significant improvement. Now, there's loads of reasons for that. You know, there might be more forensic and they're pulling more issues out, or it might be a fact that they're not actually improving. So I'd challenge, what do we do as a product of all these assurance reports and the insights which have been developed from these assurance reports? On the right hand side is something from the Australian government, and they started to publish this in about 2007, and they gave various analysis in terms of their project portfolio, and they've said these are the themes and these are the trends and some of the extracts from those assurance reports. And they used to publish those, and they published them from about 2008 till around 2012, and they stopped publishing them. And I've tried to speak to them a few times, and I got in contact with them. I did have a chat, but they're very busy at the moment. And my perception is there's only so many times you can say the same thing. And what some of these themes do is they start to replicate the APM body of knowledge, the benefits handbook, etc. So they're just repeating the best practice, and it becomes a bit anodyne, a bit dry, and not a lot of people are reading it. So they stopped publishing this information in about, I think it was about 2012, 2013. So I challenge people, what are you trying to get from this assurance information in terms of themes, and what is that doing to really change the organization trajectory in terms of improvements? Because if you look across at some of these peers, they're struggling to leverage some of these insights. So what I've been trying to do, and this is why I've got this webinar today, and I've published a couple of articles in the project magazine as well, and trying to say to people, we need to move this on. We can't be complacent about this failure. It's costing society a lot of money. And if we're overspending on projects, it means we don't spend as much on social care, schools, hospitals, etc. So there are consequences of these projects going pear-shaped. And I think we've got a public responsibility and a moral responsibility as a profession to start to drive through some of these improvements. And that's why I'm trying to champion this. So there's a few people out there who believe that this is a knowledge management problem. Now, I'd like to challenge that, because it sits with various organizations inside of the knowledge management domain. Now, is this a knowledge management problem in terms of whether you don't know or you do know? If I could first pick up this thing about technical delivery, technical delivery is a unbounded craft. If you want to know about the technical design of something and the implications of that design, etc., then we've got to understand its application, we've got to understand the technical challenges associated with it, etc. It's an unbounded technical problem. With P3M delivery, if we look at the body in terms of the science of P3M, it's bounded by our body of knowledge. So if you say to people, do you understand about benefits management, scheduling, cost control, project controls, etc., it's things that is knowable and we should know about. So in P3M, I don't think it's a lack of knowledge, it's the application of that knowledge in a dynamic and moving environment where your resources and your constraints are always moving. And if they're always moving and you've got to make priority calls, are you making the right calls? So it's for that reason, I don't think it's purely a knowledge management problem. I think that is a component of it, but I think it's much bigger than that. In terms of these lessons as well, if you just print them out in a big report or on a spreadsheet, we don't really start to understand what these lessons are. Is it something which is an act of God, something which you didn't predict and is going to blow your project up, in which case that is not the lesson. What the lesson is about your resilience to those events, and looking at your safety case and looking at your corporate resilience, etc., all the way through to these avoidable lessons. If we've got a lesson which is avoidable and you know it's avoidable, you make the same mistake, I believe there's going to be, probably the next 3 to 5 years, there'll be consequences because of that, because the system will be able to advise you that that is an avoidable mistake and you stumbled into it. If you stumbled into it, it's almost professional negligence in my view, if it's a situation which is entirely foreseeable and knowable. And I believe that's where data is going to take us. So as a profession, I think there's going to be a lot of upskilling and a lot more impact in terms of those decisions. I'm an engineer and an RPP project manager, and in engineering terms, if I design something and I do something and it falls over and it costs somebody a lot of money, then as an engineer, I suffer the consequences of that. In terms of the impact as well, with these lessons learned, we need to look at, is this an observation or a major shortfall with some major impacts? And what these lessons don't seem to capture for most organizations, not all, but most organizations, is it's missing that impact and the consequences of those lessons. And the consequences starts to drive prioritization, and it starts to drive the contingency funding and the corporate investment in making these things better in the future. So in terms of lessons, what I found with some organizations as well is the lesson learned system sits with the knowledge manager, it sits with the PMO, and the risks and issues sit with the project manager. And for me, it's the same thing, it's the same cycle. So you've got a risk and something happens with that risk and you manage it, and you either managed it well and the risk went away, in which case there's some lessons to be learned from there, or the risk actually blew up and turned into an issue and it cost your organization a lot of money, it might have cost the project, etc. All of that is a learning experience. And from those learning experiences, we need to understand, is this something which we tolerate, treat, transfer, or terminate? So there's actions associated with those learning experiences. I would challenge the audience as well, is that this is not just about actionable events. Every lesson learned is not necessarily an action, and you can fix everything and make it better in the future. It's about aggregating those insights and doing something different in the future. It's changing behaviors, it's influencing people. And the chart on the right hand side is about the correlation between the risk drawdown and the lessons learned. And that's a chart which I acquired from Crossrail, which is looking at the risk drawdown budget, and it's segregated against 43 different buckets. So then we can start to analyze what is the correlation between the risk drawdown and what they learned in terms of the rationale for that risk drawdown. And that starts to get really fascinating data. And I'm part of the Major Projects Association working group on data analytics, where we're trying to get inside of some of that Crossrail data and start to make it insightful and to start to apply that to other projects as well. So in terms of these lessons learned and your ability to exploit the lessons learned and those insights, it's to understand from a project level, is your project an enabling activity? Is this something which you do infrequently and once every blue moon, in which case it's a dissimilar project because you don't do it very often, and it's probably got a medium to long duration. So if you take an example of a new office building, it'll be the lucky person's job inside of your organization to go and procure a brand new building to put you in. It's something that you don't do very often. If we think about this being a primary activity, so you build offices for a living, you build lots of similar offices, and the project duration is still the same. But what you're trying to do in terms of your learning experience is to drive them into the left-hand corner, because when they're similar and they're short duration, there's a far greater opportunity to learn and start to recycle some of that knowledge. And if we look in the top right-hand corner, we've got Crossrail and HS2 there. They are once through, twice through, or 3 times through projects in terms of HS1, HS2, etc. But if we break them down into station builds, they become sort of much more sausage factory like, and we can start to get learning, and we can start to get value engineering associated with that, and then we can start to leverage some of that experience from those sub projects and that project delivery. So we've got to look at what is the opportunity to drive your projects and extract those insights and that experience and drive it into the left-hand corner. So instinctive behaviours, this is something which I found fascinating really, is that when you're working on a big job as a project manager, you've got loads of material to read, you've never quite got the time to read it because everything's on fire, you're trying to put the fires out, you're trying to go to lots of meetings, etc. So you tend to work on this thing called System 1 thinking, and Daniel Kahneman's done a great book on it. He got a Nobel Prize off the back of it as well, and I'd recommend you reading it as well. I think it's a really good read. And what he's saying is, if you can dip into System 2 thinking, which is something a bit more methodical, a bit more effortful, then you can start to really think through the implications of what you're doing. It's something which you should do all the time in theory, but you can't do it because you've got too much on and it's reactive thinking. So if we combine that with nudge theory, which is from Richard Thaler, it's another Nobel Prize, and I've got a great analogy here, which I quite enjoy, is that if you think about a rally driver, what we tend to do at the moment in terms of P3M community, we say to a rally driver, let's go and take your passenger seat out, and we'll take your co-driver out, and we'll put a load of manuals in there. Right along the route, we're going to put a load of road signs, and we'll put loads of road signs up every 20 meters or so, and then we'll stop the car every 300 meters to kick the tires and to do an assurance report. That's what we tend to do at the moment. And what I'd say, if you've got a qualified project manager or a junior project manager with appropriate oversight, you should be saying to them, let's treat them like a rally driver. They are qualified to drive that car. What they don't understand necessarily is the things which is going to slow them down on a sector or the risks on that sector. So instead of kicking the tires every single step of the way, why don't we instead start to say, you're a qualified project manager, I'm going to give you some feedback on where you lost sector time, where somebody spun out, where a deer ran in front of the car and they crashed the car, etc. It's those insights which can really be informative for those project managers, really making a difference. And I think if we start to think like that, we'll start to change the way that we assure and deliver projects. And I think that's really important. So in terms of bias, I went to the program management SIG last week, and there was a great presentation there on bias, and there's a load of different sort of biases, and there's a wiki page on this, and I commend you in terms of looking at that wiki page as well. There's a load of insights in it. And these biases, it's very difficult to moderate them because they're built into you, they're built into your organization as well. So what you need to try and do is to offset them a little bit and to work out what we can do in terms of moderating those biases through factual information and data. If we then start to build that data set out from your project into your business, your suppliers, the UK, all of those information in aggregation, we can then start to address some of this bias and then work out what that means for your organization and what that means for your project delivery. And that's why I think if we can take a data-centric approach, it then starts to moderate some of this bias, and it then starts to give us the insight to the rally driver about what they can do in terms of getting these insights on driving their car. So what I'd like to do now is a glimpse into the future, and I think this is coming now. It's on its way. I've been to a lot of meetups, and this is moving at pace. If we look at the data at the moment, it tends to be stored in silos. We've got project time, risk, lessons, etc. And those tend to be in separate databases, and they're not connected. There's something I call the graph database, and it sits at the back of Amazon, it sits at the back of Google search and at the back of eBay as well. And what this does is it starts to join together these disconnected data sets. So you can start to query right across those data sets. And through a graph as well, it's really efficient and you can do it extremely quickly. So what do I mean by a graph database? So what it does basically is you've got these things called triples. So it's two nodes joined together. So if you've got a compensation event and a claim, those are your two nodes, and the compensation event results in a claim, and that's the edge. And what you do basically is you build a data set through lots of these triples, and you get more and more insights, and you start to query those insights. So if I take these lessons learned from Northern Ireland, and it's published as a big data set, and you can Google it, so just Google Northern Ireland finance lessons learned, and you'll start to get these insights. And they're very bland. You don't really know what they're associated with. You don't know what the impact of the data is, etc. It's a long list of these lessons learned. If we then look at the silos of data, you can start to get some more insights, because you can then get the connection between the lesson and the risk and the money and the project, but it's still siloed data because you're still looking at a connected basis. If we then blow this up in terms of connected data, you will find it's not a hierarchical structure, it's a many-to-many relationship, and what you're looking for is things like centrality, for instance, where there's lots of things going on around a node, because that's something that you're going to be interested in, and what the connections are between some of these data points. That's when you truly get the insights, and that's where we're going to be starting to move to. So I'd like to give you an example of reference class forecasting, and this is something which has been around for probably at least 15 years. And what we tend to do with reference class forecasting, we take this outside view, and it says, if you want to do your project and it's going to take so long and cost so much money, what's the experience from your peers in terms of delivering something very similar, and what's the experience of your organization in its ability to deliver these sorts of jobs. So there's some massive data sets which exist out there, and Side Business School's got some of that data as well, and you can really then start to challenge that bias and then put an uplift on those projects, because you can then moderate between what you think it's going to cost and what it actually will cost. If we start to expand that out now to include risks and issues, assumptions, management actions, lessons, we validate that data, we can then start to work up this data model associated with the graph and really start to understand the connectivity in that data. But it's not just a database in its own right, it all needs to be related to each other. So it's driven by the use case, and the use case then feeds the data model, and that needs to be driven by millions of data points. And there's an article which I found recently and a great podcast, and I'd commend that to you. There's some great and the good speaking in that. I think Daniel Carmen was speaking in that as well. It's a great webinar. I'd commend that to you as well. I think that's worth listening to. I think it was about 30 minutes or so, and that starts to give you some insights in terms of where these great thinkers believe that we're going to go next in terms of data, and it's generally supporting this sort of approach. So in terms of revision, if we start to think about risks, and I'll just give you some examples now. It's the risks which materialize which we weren't expecting, those risks which have blown up and impacted our program, which risks we weren't able to influence, which risk management action was successful, what you do in terms of investing your time to get the best return from it, what's the probabilities and the impact of those risks. So instead of an informed guess, because you get the great and the good sat around the table and you get your post-it notes out and you say, this is my risk assessment, you can now reach into the data set and say the probability of that risk in this context is probably in these bounds, and it's a lot more data-driven, evidence-driven, instead of your own view, which is probably influenced by bias. The schedule implications, the benefits implications, and governance, we can start to get some automation of that governance as well, because it shows you where to look. It can start to predict where things are going to go wrong on your project. It shows where you're out of bounds in terms of comparing you against some of your peers, etc. And it really starts to drive those insights. So if you take some of these examples, so on Amazon you've got these recommender systems, and those recommender systems would say, for instance, I'm at a certain stage of a project, and what do I need to know about? What's likely to go wrong? In terms of deep learning, and there's an example on systems now, which is starting to come to fruition on valuing a property. And what they do is they don't just take your location and whether you've got schools nearby and your postcode and look at Rightmove, etc. They start to look at the photographs of the front of your house and they compare them against the library and see if you've got a 1960s house versus a thatched cottage, etc. They then start to drive the valuation of your house. And in the US, these are now getting better than the actual valuers themselves. So if we look at that in terms of project management, there's a massive capability now if we can take that deep learning stack and think of all those factors which influence a certain decision. Have we got the data out there which then starts to drive some of these insights? On text analytics as well, it's processing these large volumes of reports and insights and then start to drive some insights from that data set. Look at topic modeling, for instance, and we can start to understand sentiment analysis with those documents as well. It's very difficult to do that on an individual basis, and I know there's some project managers out there who've been throwing sentiment analysis at certain reports, and I'd say to you, be careful of doing that because it needs an aggregation and the algorithms need to be working in an aggregated form. So there's some drawbacks with doing this if you don't fully understand the basis of those algorithms which you're applying. And I found this slide really interesting as well. It's a Gartner slide and it's moving from this information driven approach, which is all based around hindsight and what happened, etc., and driving it forward into foresight. And I'd like to challenge the community. What can we do to drive our data set? Because there's so much data out there. If we can just start to pool it for collective advantage, what can we do in terms of driving this predictive analytics in the future? And then it starts to say, if we know what's going to occur on a project and what the outcomes are going to be, what can we do to influence it to make it a lot better in the future? That's when life really starts to get exciting. And there's no reason why we can't do this. All the technology is there. It's a matter of collating the data and pulling the community together is to start to work on this and really start to drive it forward. And things are changing now. They're changing at the fastest pace I think I've ever seen them changed. And in terms of the data, you'll see something from the Major Projects Association there, and it's a statement about the failure to digitize and utilize this data. It's starting to give us a lot of challenges across Britain and across society. And there's a great document there called Data for the Public Good. It shows a lot of thought leadership from the National Infrastructure Commission, and it's something we should be doing a lot more of across society, and it starts to drive this value that we can extract from this data. In the meetup last night, so I've got this meetup called the London Project Data Analytics Meetup. We went through the major projects reports from the Infrastructure Projects Authority. We also pulled out a load of data from the IT dashboard in the US, and that's billions of pounds worth of projects, and it's all online dashboards, etc. And there's an ICT dashboard in Australia as well, Western Australia, and that's got loads of interactive data and you can start to drill into it. But the problem is it's quite flat. You get pie charts on a project, you can tell if the project's late or it's not late, but in terms of aggregated data, it's very difficult to understand what to do with that data. So what we can do, and I think this is the challenge now to a government and to the private sector, is things are moving so quickly, and the ability to extract this data and to do something with it, people can do it in a matter of days. So instead of publishing these flat PDF reports, why don't we start to publish things like this? So I've set this website up called leveragingexperience.com, and I've invited various people to join me on this journey as well. And what we've done is we've taken that major projects report information and we started to analyze it, and we've said which of those projects, which were amber, green or green, which of those projects have got worse in the following 12 months and to what extent. And you'll see from that data slice that at least 50% of them have got worse, and a big chunk of them have got worse by more than 50%. So what that's telling us is that there's a lot of optimism bias in that RAG reporting. And those are the insights which you can't get from the flat data. So you need to think through the use case when you start to crunch this data. So if you think about predisposition, and I think this is fascinating as well. The project environment is emergent, it's not definitive, it's always going to be moving around you. So what we need to understand is there's certain situations which are more probable and plausible than others. So what does that mean for our projects? So we need to understand what conditions our projects are predisposed to, whether those conditions could result in something which is a terminal outcome or merely an irritation, whether those conditions are treatable and what we can do about it. We don't solve diabetes by telling people not to eat cakes and chocolate, etc., etc. What we tend to do is we illustrate this future, which is based upon a certain outlook related to their situation. We show them what other people have achieved, and we start to identify what they can do in real outcomes based around other things that's happened around them. That's what we tend to do in changing behaviours in things like health and social care. So why don't we do this on projects? Why is it always that we try and put more and more signposts on the road instead of providing these insights to people? So in terms of structuring the data, some people think this is a big data lake that we need, and we've got a bit of this with Crossrail at the moment. There's a big bucket of stuff, and that's fine. If you've got shopping data from Amazon, for instance, you can do all sorts of analytics on it. But for me, it's a mixture between a data lake and a data warehouse. And a data warehouse is where you start to structure your data based around your use case, the user stories, the views, and the data model that goes with it. It's only then that you can really then start to make sure that you got the right data. And risk management is a prime example. There's a lot of people with risk management just manage the risk register in terms of the here and now. And what we're interested in is the life cycle of those risks, which risks have gone badly wrong, etc. And what does that mean for future project delivery? That's probably in your data set, but it might get overwritten all the time. You don't collate it, etc. If you pull that into your data warehouse, you can then start to analyze it. But it needs to be use case driven, otherwise you're collecting loads of stuff. And collecting data costs you money. In terms of some organizations, they've said that we're not ready for this. And I would say there's a massive driver for change. There's efficiency, there's a thirst for data. This is going to need millions of data points. If you don't start to collate your data now, you'll never be ready for it, because it's going to take you potentially 3 years, up to 5 years to get the benefit from this. So it's a longer journey. I went to a meetup with Lance Olson, who is the program director for artificial intelligence in Microsoft. And it's Lance's belief that machine learning and artificial intelligence is going to be bigger than the internet. So it's going to have some massive implications in terms of everything we're doing. And it's all the reputational impacts as well. And there's a great presentation that I went to from Rod Soden last week at the Program Management SIG. And what he's trying to argue is that it's the top performers who start to drive this forward. It's those with a level 3+ who's got this committed leadership, they've got a hunger for improvement, self-critical and restless, it's a learning organization, etc. I don't fully subscribe to that. I think there's some merit in it, but what that's saying is, if you've not got the P3M systems in place, then there's no point in collecting this data and looking at the lessons learned and what you can extract from that experience. I don't think that's right. I think there's some middle ground somewhere, and I think that's worthy of further discussion. So where do we start? I think we need to start off with a vision in the survey in terms of where you are. We look at the use cases and the data, and then we start to spin it up through some agile iteration, where we then start to get some people on board with the dream, and you start to reinforce that vision and demonstrate what you can do in terms of an organization. It's not a 3-month exercise. I think it's a multi-year journey, and it will take time, because you've got to get the data to build, you've got to get the insights to build, and you've got people to engage with it. In terms of summary, I believe that lessons learned systems are largely ineffective unless, and I think that's a big story about the unless, and I can give you some examples of that and have a long conversation about that, but I've not got time today, unfortunately. I believe the solution is going to be data driven, and there's going to be more and more pressure to open up the data. And if we look at UK government, we're way behind the US, Australia and New Zealand as well to a certain extent. And I think we need to change the pace of opening up this data, because it's not just opening up the data to pick at it, it's opening up the data to get the insight, which can drive the models, which can then start to drive this productivity improvement. It's not flat data either, it's connected data, and it starts to enable us to avoid these problems which we know are avoidable. We can start to get these decisions increasingly shaped by experience, and machine learning is marching towards us at pace, and it's something which we must engage with as a profession and a community. So what I've done, I've set this a meetup called the London Project Data and Analytics Meetup. It was 388 last week, it's now up to about 425. If you want to come along to that, you're more than welcome. It's a free meetup. It's sponsored by Recruiter as well, so we get free drinks and pizza as well. It's in the evening around once a month. So if you'd like to come, what we're trying to do is to shape this future between us and to do it as a community as well. It's a really exciting journey. So that's the end of my presentation. I've run over slightly and squeezed some of the question time. Sorry about that. Are there any questions?
Martin, what I'll do, I'll flick back to the Mentimeter screen and I'll just show a screen that I think is quite useful. Just to let people know, within the benefits management SIG, we see reflective practice as being something really important. What we'd like you to do is just send in your thoughts on what you've learned from this webinar as we just tackle a couple of questions. So first of all, is there any standard software or standard body for the analysis of data that you would recommend, Martin?
I think it depends really. What is your use case and what you're trying to achieve? If you've got a very specific use case, then there's probably a very specific piece of software that's going to solve it. So you can then start to apply the software to it. I'm trying to say is that I don't think it's necessarily a software solution where we're heading to. I think it's a data solution. So if you can invest in the data and the data tools, which starts to analyze and get the connections in the data, you can then put user interfaces over the top, which can then enable you to interrogate your data. But you've got a fully connected data set then, which you can start to interrogate. I think that's where it starts to get really exciting.
Okay, and with reference to what we're seeing in the news today and bearing in mind GDPR, how easy will it be to pull the data?
So that's about personal data. This is about project data. I've been asking for some data, for instance, from parts of government, and they go through the reports and they redact people's names. And I've got no problem with that. I don't need to see names. I just need to see what the value of these projects are, what the variance is, and what the reason for those variances are. I think as we build this data set out, there's a big risk of dipping into a GDPR, but I think it's manageable because we just do a risk assessment on those data fields as appropriate and make sure that they're redacted, or we take them out of the data set at source.
One more, whilst part of the problem is a personal lack of application of knowledge, how much is it also to do with organisational culture and commitment?
Massively. I think that's the biggest driver. If they don't see this dream and they don't see that it's something that we need to do today, then it's never going to happen. And I think that those organisations will be a bit Carillion-esque. They will die because this is moving at such a pace. If you don't keep up with it and you don't start to invest in your data, other people will leapfrog you. So I think this is going to be so transformational. And if you start to think about the organisational culture, it's the culture which needs this thirst for knowledge, all of those traits which Rob Toden identified. I think if you've got those in place, you can really make this fly. If you put this as a sticking plaster on top, I think you'll bimble through it and you won't sort of really get that return on investment.
Okay, thanks for that. We've got some great questions, but I think we're out of time now. We'll certainly share them with you, Martin, and look forward to your responses on that. We've had some great responses in Mentimeter, so that's been absolutely brilliant. You know, we hear that you're really passionate about this, so thank you for your contribution.
Thanks a lot, everybody. And if you want to get in contact on any of this, you want to join the meetup, then please let me know. I'll be delighted to work with you on it.